The Education of Little Tree by Forrest Carter. Grandpa's Trade, page 355. In all his 70-odd years, Grandpa had never held a job in public works. Public works, to mountain folks, meant any kind of job that paid for hire. Grandpa couldn't tolerate regular hire. He said all it done was used up time without satisfaction, which is reasonable. In 1930, when I was 5 years old, a bushel of corn sold for 25 cents. That is, if you could find anybody that would buy a bushel of corn, which was not likely. Even if it had sold for $10 a bushel, me and Grandpa could not have made a living at it. Our corn patch was too little. Grandpa had a trade, though. He said every man ought to have a trade, and ought to take pride in it. And Grandpa did. His trade was handed down on the Scotch side of his family for several hundred years. Grandpa was a whiskey maker. When you bring up whiskey making, most folks outside the mountains give it a bad name, but their judgments are allowed on what big city criminals do. Big city criminals hire fellas to run off whiskey, not caring what kind of whiskey it is, just so they run off a lot of it and fast. Such men will use potash or lye to turn their mash quick and give their whiskey a good quote-unquote bead. They'll run their whiskey through sheet iron or tin and truck radiators, which has all kinds of poisons and can kill a man. Grandpa said such fellers ought to be hung. Grandpa said you could make bad judgments about any trade, giving it a bad name, if you judged by the worst that was carrying on the trade. Grandpa said his clothes suit was as spanking good as the day he married up in it 50-odd years ago. He said the tailor that made it had taken pride in his work. Howsoever, there was tailors that didn't. Your judgment of the tailoring trade was dependent on which kind of tailor ye went by. Same as a whiskey-making trade, which is right. Grandpa would never put anything in his whiskey, not even sugar. Sugar is used to stretch out the whiskey and make more of it, but Grandpa said it was not pure whiskey when this was done. He made pure whiskey, nothing but corn in the makings. He also had no patience at all with aging whiskey. Grandpa said he had heard all his life this'n and that'n mouthing off about how much better aged whiskey was. He said he tried it once. Said he set some fresh whiskey back and let it sit for a week, and when he tasted of it, it didn't taste one lick damn different from all the other whiskey he made. Grandpa said that where folks got that at was letting whiskey set in barrels for a long time until it picked up the scent and the color of the barrels. He said if a damn fool wanted to smell of a barrel, he'd ought to go stick his head in one and smell of it, then go get himself a drink of honest whiskey. Grandpa called such people barrel sniffers. He said he could put stump water in a barrel and let it set long enough and sell it to such folks, and they'd drink it because it smelled like a barrel. Grandpa was right put out about the whole whiskey barrel business. He said the thing was likely started, if it could be checked out, by big shots that could afford setting their whiskey up for years at a time. This way they squeezed out the little man who couldn't afford to set his whiskey back to get a barrel smell. He said they spent a creek full of money to sell their whiskey as having a better barrel smell than anybody's else, and so total fooled a lot of possum-headed idiots that they'd ought to drink it. But there was still sensible folks, Grandpa said, who had not taken up barrel sniffing, and so the little men could still get by. Grandpa said that since whiskey making was the only trade he knowed, and since I was 5 coming on to 6, then he reckoned I would have to learn that trade. He advised that when I got older I might want to switch trades, but I would know whiskey making and could always have a trade to fall back on in times when I was pushed otherwise to making a living. I seen right off that me and Grandpa had a fight on our hands with the big shots that was pushing barrel-sniffing whiskey, but I was proud that Grandpa had taken me in to learn the trade. Grandpa's still was back up in the Narrows where the spring branch run out of the creek. It was set back in laurels and honeysuckle, so thick that a bird couldn't find it. Grandpa was proud of it, for it was pure copper, the pot and the cap arm and the coil, which was called a worm. It was a little steel, as steels go, but we didn't need a big one. Grandpa only made one run a month, which always come out to 11 gallons. We sold 9 gallons to Mr. Jenkins, who run the store at the crossroads, at $2 a gallon, which you can see was a lot of money for our corn. It bought all the necessaries and put a little money back besides, and Grandma kept that in a tobacco sack stuffed down in a fruit jar. Grandma said that I had a share in it, for I was working hard and learning the trade too. Our 2 gallons we kept there. Grandpa liked to have some in his jug for occasional liquoring and setting in before company, and Grandma used considerable of it in her cough medicine. Grandpa said it was also necessary for snake bite, spider bite, heel bruises, and lots of things like that. I seen right off that stilling, if you done it proper, was hard work. Most people making whiskey use white corn. We didn't have any. We used Indian corn, which is the only kind we grew. It is dark red and give our whiskey a light red tint, which nobody else had any like. We was proud of our color. Everybody knew it when they saw it. We would shell the corn. Grandma helped, and some of it we put in a tow sack. We poured warm water over the sack and let it lay in the sun or in the winter by the fireplace. You had to turn the sack 2 or 3 times a day to keep the corn stirred up. In 4 or 5 days it had long sprouts. The other shell corn we ground up into meal. We couldn't stand the expense of taking it to a miller, for he would take out a toll. Grandpa had built his own grist mill. It had 2 rocks set against each other, and we turned them with a handle. Me and Grandpa would tote the mill up the hollow and the Narrows to the still. We had a wood trough that we stuck in the spring branch and ran water to the pot till it was filled 3/4 full. Then we poured the meal in and started a fire under the pot. We used ash wood for ash because it makes no smoke. Grandpa said that more than likely any wood would be all right, but there was no sense in taking a chance, which was right. Grandpa fixed me a box, which we set on a stump by the pot. I stood on the box and stirred the meal water while it cooked. I couldn't see over the top, never seen exactly what I was stirring, but Grandpa said I done good and was never known to let a batch scorch, even when my arms got tired. After we cooked it, we drawed it off through a slop arm in the bottom into a barrel and added the sprout corn, which we had ground up. Then we covered the barrel and let it set. It would set about 4 or 5 days, but each day we had to go and stir it up. Grandpa said it was working. After 4 or 5 days, there'd be a cap of hard crust on it. We'd break up the cap until it was about gone, and then we was ready to make a run. Grandpa had a big bucket and I had a little one. We dipped out the barrel and poured the beer, that's what Grandpa called it, into the pot. Grandpa set the cap on the pot and we put our wood to fire under it. When the beer boiled, it sent steam up through the cap arm, which was connected to the worm, the coil of the copper tubing running around in circles. The worm was set in a barrel, and we had cold water from the spring branch running in our trough through the barrel. This made the steam turn back to liquid, and the worm come out at the bottom of the barrel. Where it come out, we had hickory coals to strain off the barley grease, which would make you sick if you drank it. After all of this, you would think we would get a lot of whiskey, but we only got about 2 gallons. We set the 2 gallons aside and drained off the backends, which didn't turn to steam in the pot. Then we had to scrub the whole thing down. The 2 gallons we had, Grandpa called them singles. He said they was over 200 proof. We put the back ends and the singles back in the pot, started the fire, and done it all over again, adding some water. This time we got our 11 gallons. As I say, it was hard work, and I never could figure out how some folks would say that lazy good-for-nothings made whiskey. Whoever says that without a doubt has never made any. Grandpa was the best at his trade. Whiskey can be ruined a lot more ways than it can be made good. The fire can't be too hot. If you let the workings lay too long, vinegar sets up. If you run early, it's too weak. You must be able to read a bead and judge its proofing. I seen why Grandpa taken such pride in his trade, and I tried to learn. Some things I could do which Grandpa said he didn't really see how he had managed until I come along. He would lower me into the pot after a run, and I scrubbed it out, which I always done as fast as I could, for it was usually pretty hot. I toted ash wood and kept everything stirred up. It kept us busy. When me and Grandpa was at the still, Grandma kept the dogs locked up. Grandpa said if anybody was to come up the hollow, then Grandma was to turn loose Blue Boy and send him up the trail. Blue Boy, having the best nose, would pick up our scent and show up at the still, and then we would know somebody was on the trail. Grandpa said he started out using Old Rippet, but Old Rippet commenced eating the leftover backends and got drunk. He take and do it regular. Grandpa said Old Rippet might near turn to steady liquoring before you put a stop to it. Once he led old Maud to the still, and she got drunk too, so he switched to Blue Boy. There are many other things that a good mountain whiskey maker must know. You have to be careful to clean up good after a run, because if you don't, it will smell of sour mash. Grandpa said the law was just like hound dogs and had noses for smell that could pick up a mash scent miles away. Grandpa said he reckoned that this was where the name Law Dogs come from. He said if you could check it out, they was all handed down from a special bred-up line used by kings and such, like hounds to track folks. But Grandpa said if I ever had occasion to see any of them, I would notice they all had a smell about them too, which helped folks some in knowing they was about. Also, you had to be careful not to knock your bucket against the pot. You can hear a bucket striking a pot for maybe 2 miles in the mountains. This caused me considerable worry until I got on to it, for I had to dip my bucket in the barrel, tote it to the pot, climb up on the stump and box, and lean way over to dump in the beer. I shortly got to where I never struck my bucket. You couldn't sing nor whistle neither. But me and Grandpa talk. Regular talk will carry a long way in the mountains. Most folks don't know, the Cherokees do, that there is a range of tone you can talk in that when it carries will sound like mountain sounds, wind in the trees and blush and maybe running water. That's the way me and Grandpa talk. We listen to the birds while we worked. If the birds fly off and the tree crickets stop singing, look out. Grandpa said there was so many things to handle in your head that I was not to worry about picking it all up at once, that it would come and be nature to me after a while, which eventually it did. Grandpa had a mark for his whiskey. It was his maker's mark, scratched on top of every fruit jar lid. Grandpa's mark was shaped like a tomahawk, and nobody else in the mountains used it. Each maker had his own mark. Grandpa said that when he passed on, which more than likely he would eventually do, I would get the mark handed down to me. He had got it from his pa at Mr. Jenkins' store. At Mr. Jenkins' store, there was men who come in and would not buy any other whiskey but Grandpa's with his mark. Grandpa said that as a matter of fact, since me and him was more or less partners now, half the mark was owned by me at the present time. This was the first time I had ever owned anything as to call it mine, so I was right proud of our mark and seen to it as much as Grandpa that we never turned out no bad whiskey under our mark, which we didn't. I guess one of the scaredest times of my life come about while making whiskey. It was late winter, just before spring. Me and Grandpa was finishing up our last run. We had sealed the half-gallon fruit jars and was putting them into tow sacks. We always put leaves in the tow sacks too, for this helped us to keep from breaking our jars. Grandpa always carried 2 big tow sacks. With most of the whiskey, I carried a little tow sack with 3 half-gallon jars. I eventually got to where I could carry 4, but at that time I could only carry 3. It was a pretty big load for me, and toting it back down the trail, I would have to stop considerable, set it down and rest. Grandpa did too. We was just finishing our sacking when Grandpa said, "Damn, there's Blue Boy." There he was, laying by the side of the still with his tongue hanging out. What scared me and Grandpa was that we didn't know how long he had been there. He'd come up without a word and laid down. I said, "Damn," too. As I say, me and Grandpa occasionally cussed when it wasn't around Grandma. Grandpa was already listening. All the sounds was the same. The birds had not flown away. Grandpa said, "Ye taken up your sack and head back down the trail. If you see somebody, step off the trail till they pass. I'll take time to clean up and hide the still and go down to other mountainside. I'll meet you at the cabin." I grabbed up my sack and throwed it over my shoulder so fast it nearly jerked me over backwards, but I wobbled out fast as I could and got on the narrows trail. I was scared, but I knew this was necessary. Still come first. Flatlanders could never understand what it meant to bust up a mountain man's still. It would be as bad as the Chicago fire to people in Chicago. Grandpa's still had been handed down to him, and now at his age it was not likely that he could ever replace it. To have it busted up would not only put me and Grandpa out of business, it would put me and him and Grandma where it would be practical intolerable to make a living. There was no way at all of living on 25-cent corn, even if you had enough corn to sell, which we didn't, and even if you could sell it, which we couldn't. Grandpa didn't have to explain to me how desperate it was that we save the still. So I taken off. It was hard to trot with the 3 fruit jars in my sack. Grandpa sent Blue Boy with me. I kept my own Blue Boy walking just ahead of me, for he could pick a scent out of the wind long before you could hear anything. The mountains rose high on either side of the Narrows Trail, and there was just room to walk on the bank of the Spring Branch. Me and Blue Boy had come maybe halfway down the Narrows when we heard a big racket break out down on the hollow trail. Grandma had turned all the dogs loose, and they was howling and baying up the trail. Something was wrong. I stopped, and Blue Boy did too. The dogs were coming on, turning up the Narrows toward us. Blue Boy raised his ears and tail and sniffed the air. Hairs ruffled on his back, and he started walking stiff-legged ahead of me. I sure appreciated old Blue Boy right then. Then there they was. They come around the bend of the trail all of a sudden and stopped and looked at me. They appeared like an army, though. Thinking back, it was likely not more than four of them. They were the biggest fellers I'd ever seen, and they had badges shining on their shirts. They stood and stared at me like they had never seen such before. I stopped and watched them too. My mouth got clacker dry and my knees commenced to wobble. "Hey," one of them hollered, "by God, it's a kid." Another one said, "A damn Indian kid," which with me wearing moccasins, deer pants, and shirt with my hair long and black, I couldn't hardly see no way of passing as anything else. One of them said, "What you got in that sack, kid?" And another one hollered, "Look out for that hound." Blue Boy was walking real slow toward them. He was growling low, showing his teeth. Blue Boy meant business. They started walking cautious up the trail toward me. I seen that I could not get around them. If I jumped in the Spring Branch, they would catch me, and if I run back up the trail, I would be leading them to the still. That would put me and Grandpa out of business, and 'twas my responsibility, same as Grandpa's, to save the still. I taken to the side of the mountain. There is a way to run up a mountain. If you ever have to run up a mountain, which I hope you don't. Grandpa had showed me the way. Cherokees do it. You don't run straight up. You run along the side and angle up as you go, but you don't hardly run on the ground. This is because you place your feet on the high side of brush and tree hunks and roots, which gives you good footing so you'll never slip. You can make fast time. This is what I did. Instead of angling up the mountain away from the men, which would have taken me back to the Narrows, I headed up the side that led down the trail toward the men. This made me pass right over their heads, and they broke off the trail toward me, thrashing in the brush, and one of them nearly reached my foot as I passed. He did manage to grab the brush I had stepped on and was so close I might near knew he was going to kill me right off. But Blue Boy bit him on the leg. He hollered and fell backwards on the men behind him, and I kept running. I heard Blue Boy. He was growling and fighting. He got kicked or hit because I heard the wind go out of him. And he yelped, but he was right back fighting again. I was running all the time, fast as I could, which wasn't too fast, as the fruit jars were slowing me up. I heard the men clambering up the mountain behind me, and about that time the rest of the hounds hit. I could tell old Rippets growling and howling, playing, and old Mauns sounded like pretty fearful mixed in with the men yelling and hollering and cussing. Later on, Grandpa said he heard it plumb over on the other side of the mountain. It sounded like an entire war had broke out. I kept running as long as I could. After a while, I had to stop. I felt like I was going to bust. But it didn't stop long. Kept on going till I was sitting right on top of the mountain. Last part of the climbing had to drag my fruit jars. I was that wore out. I could still hear the dogs and men. They're moving back down the Narrows Trail and then the Hollow Trail. It was a continuous squalling and cussing and yelling all the way, like a big ball of sound that rolled down the trail till I couldn't hear it no more. Though I was so tired I couldn't stand up, I felt right good about it, for they didn't go near the still, and I knew Grandpa would be pleased. My legs was weak, and so I laid down in the leaves and slept. When I woke up, it was dark. The moon had come up over the far mountain nearly full and was bringing light to the hollows way down below me. Then I heard the hounds. I knew Grandpa had sent them after me, for they didn't bay like they did on a fox trail. Their voices sounded kind of whiny, like they was trying to get me to answer them. They'd picked up my trail, for they were angling up the mountain. I whistled and heard them yelp and bark. In a minute, they was covering me up, licking my face and jumping all over me. Even old Ringer had come, and him might near blind. Me and the hounds come down off the mountain. Old Moll couldn't stand it and run ahead barking and howling to tell Grandma and Grandpa I had been found, aiming to take all the credit herself, I reckon, though she couldn't smell a lick. As I come down the hollow, I saw Grandma out in the trail. She had lit the lamp and was holding it before her like she had set a light to guide me home. Grandpa was with her. They didn't come up the trail, but stood and watched as I come along with the dogs. I felt good about that. I still had my fruit jars and had not broke any. Grandma set the lamp down and knelt to meet me. She grabbed me so hard she nearly made me drop my fruit jars. Grandpa said he would carry the fruit jars the rest of the way. Grandpa said he couldn't have done any better himself, and him going on 70-odd years. He said I was likely coming on to be the finest whiskey maker in the mountains. Grandpa said I might wind up being better than him, which I knew wasn't likely, but I was proud he said it. Grandma never said nothing. She toted me the rest of the way home, but I could have made it more than likely. End of chapter.